In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God, Christ is in our midst. The Lord's lesson on forgiveness is dramatized in the parable of the unmerciful servant heard in today's gospel. The practice of forgiveness is at the heart of the Christian faith, and its forgiveness aims at addressing the sin of pride. The practice of mercy and forgiveness is also the alternative to harboring resentment and bitterness that can lead you and I to consequences of humiliation in a power struggle with rage and chaos, if not, God forbid, violence. In his letter to the Church of Corinth in chapter 5, St. Paul distinguishes between the practice of forgiveness among believers from unbelievers. He points out that unbelievers ignore and disregard the Christian practice of forgiveness. That should not be surprising. Important to this subject is the apostolic teaching about Christians who take each other to secular court. Sadly, this goes on all the time, and in many cases involving family members. An unforgiving heart can manifest anger from deep-seated resentment and animosity, often from being treated unfairly. And these unresolved feelings are frequently viewed by others today, as we say in America, carrying a chip on one shoulder or having an axe to grind. Our culture has made pride and being tough as a matter of winning and not losing. No one wants to be called a loser. Consequently, we interpret forgiveness as a weakness or being a loser and not a winner. This is not the Christian way of thinking, and as difficult as it may be, you and I should not be surprised but cautious in order to discern the attitudes and practices of those who do not believe. Today's gospel, therefore, illustrates the selfish hypocrisy of the unforgiving servant. The king's servant in the parable shares a similar opportunity as the king, but ends up facing the consequence of a harsh judgment for failing to be merciful. In the lesson, we find that the king's servant had the capacity to exercise the same power as the king with his fellow servants. But notice, the practice of being merciful began with the benevolent king, who takes the initiative to settle accounts with his servant. What happens in turn is the servant who was forgiven not only disregards the mercy of the king, he fails to even mention or express thankfulness to the king. Consequently, what follows is that the forgiven servant is without mercy to his fellow servant. And notice, he seeks to find his fellow servant that owes him far less than what he once had debt, and physically grabs him by the throat and says, "Pay what you owe." Unlike the initiative of the king, the unmerciful servant's initiative is not only mean, it's vindictive. And you know the sad ending of the parable. The goal and objective of the lesson of the parable is to help us to understand that unless forgiveness comes from our heart, it will be hypocritical. Moreover, we can also conclude that the forgiveness we are speaking about is more than resolving a business transaction. And that, my friends, is sadly the way of thinking that has affected the Christian mind. Bishop Emilianos, addressing the struggle that we have with forgiving others in his third volume of his book, Walking on the Waves, that we're reading in our weekly Bible study, and those of you who are discussing on Sunday after liturgy, he explains that failing to forgive is related to the sin of resentment. In Talk 10, the bishop is asked, how can we overcome resentment and genuinely wish someone well? Beyond prayer and asking for God's help, how do we invite God to help us release and forget resentment? In his reply, he says, to forgive is even more. To forget, we must first come to know ourselves. But this kind of knowledge doesn't come easy. It comes through knowing God. So as we begin to know Him, we gain the strength to see ourselves clearly. And when this happens, we come to a humbling realization. Whatever others may have done to us is likely no worse than what we have done, especially when we consider the blessings and knowledge God has given us and how often we fall short. He says, if God has blessed us with so much and we fall short, how can we expect perfection from others, especially when we know they carry weaknesses to bring them down? This kind of understanding only comes through humility, a deep and honest awareness of who we are before God. Once we begin to see ourselves through God's eyes, we simply cannot hold anything against anyone. He goes on to say, it's often the case that the very things we judge in others become our own struggles later. Finally, he says, forgiveness is not optional. We must forgive and even embrace those who have wronged us. That is what Christ did, and God does not make mistakes. He gave His life for those who betrayed Him. There was no resentment in Him, only love. The more we draw near to Him, the more we begin to think like Him. And the more we think like Him, the more we're able to forgive, not only with words, but from the heart. So the real work, he says, is not to fix others so we can forgive them. The work is within us. And once this inner work begins, forgiveness, forgetting, and even loving our enemies becomes not only possible, but natural. Christ is in our midst.